Hey everyone, I hope everyone has had a wonderful Halloween. I'm sure everyone's gotten their spooks and frights and all those great things we remember as kids. But for all you history buffs, history students, science geeks, science fiction fanatics, this is a video for you. So I'm just starting out on this platform, so bear with me. I'm a little shy, but that's okay. I'm going to talk to you about some conspiracy theories and some problems that actually led to the sinking of the famed RMS Titanic. Everyone knows that story. And this phenomenon that had recently been discovered about 7 years ago called a space hurricane. Yeah, you heard me right. A space hurricane. You may wonder, CJ Money, what's that? Don't worry, I will get to that right before the end of this video. So before I do, shoot me a like and subscribe to my channel as I will be progressing further into different fields, different topics, different types of discussions. Please feel free to comment your thoughts on some of the facts that I've collected for you, and let's get into the video. So back in the early 20th century, the company called the White Star Line, they're one of the major transportation companies at that time for shipping and vessels and whatnot. They had commissioned the port city of Belfast's Harland and Wolff shipyard for the construction of, you guessed it, the RMS Titanic, one of three sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic, and of course the Titanic, of course. So getting into April 10th, 1912, which was kind of the send-off date after the construction was finished. So they had to go from Belfast to Southampton, Southampton, England. Keep that in mind. And then it would set off from Southampton to, I believe, back to Ireland to pick up a few other passengers. And then it would set off across the North Atlantic right to the great city of New York City, the concrete jungle, everyone's golden dreams of fame and whatnot on this side of the Mississippi. Anyways, so just a couple statistics for you. There's, I believe, 2,340 in total that were passengers and crew on the ship. 126 of that number were kids. I believe there were some pets as well, but after the sinking, unfortunately, none of them made it. So the Titanic had some safety measures and a couple issues that went with that. I'll get into that in just a second. And their communications was this radio telegraph transmitter that sent what's called a Marconigram. If you're interested in that, I'd be happy to look it up for you. Basically, it's just a message sent by that transmitter. It's kind of like a telegraph. So some of the safety measures on the Titanic was that it had watertight compartments at the bottom hull, and it was divided into 16 across the entire ship. In the case of sinking, which wasn't on anybody's mind because the Titanic was called the unsinkable ship, and that's what drew the attention of most of the rich folks, especially the first-class passengers, and of course the luxury of the ship and its maiden voyage, the whole shebang. So these watertight compartments at the bottom of the hull would be accessible by remotely activated doors, which was another innovation of the Industrial Revolution. So yes, to kind of segue back into the case of a sinking for the unsinkable ship, how ironic is that, right? It's 16 lifeboat davits on many parts of the top of the ship. They would lower 3 boats at a time. So in total, there should have been roughly between 40 and 50 boats in total. Each boat could carry a third of the population that was on the ship, a number that unfortunately was never reached that night. April 14th, 1912 was that fateful night, about 4 days later. So 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada, is this glacier field full of nothing but icebergs. Icebergs that had drifted off from the North Pole. So obviously the conditions were cold. The air was kind of thin. It was basically a very miserable place to be if you don't like the cold. But that is pertains to the main problem. So as the Titanic was coming along into this area, 3 warnings were issued to them about an hour before the infamous collision from a nearby ship called the Californian. Well, they had ignored it because they were trying to test the range of these marconograms from the radio telegraph transmitter to see how far it would go, reach out to somebody. So they're like, hey, it's coming in way too loud. Please don't talk to us. Another fatal mistake. And although there should have been 48 boats in total, it was actually 20. And the reason why is the chairman of the White Star Line, a man by the name of Joseph Ismay, a man that was, after the incident, was so humiliated and so shunned from society for being, and quite frankly, listed a coward because of the famous woman and children rule. He actually purposely did that to cover costs of some other things that were afforded to him on that ship. And not just that, but he had to follow a certain regulation at the time. Obviously, a regulation that was thankfully reformed since then. So on ships of that era, lifeboats were kind of alleviated due to the size of the ship, not by the population on the ship. I know, that is absolutely mind-blowing. Why would anyone think of that as a good idea? Obviously, the people of Titanic, they were in for a wake-up call. So I'm going to take you back to that night, April 14th, 1912. Imagine you were either a rich, pretty well-off first-class passenger, you're a middle-class passenger, which is the second class. You're a regular businessman, artisan, craftsman, what have you. And then you have your low income and your poverty. That's your third class. And that's also people consider the undesirable immigrants, the Irish, the Mexicans. I believe there was one Japanese man on the Titanic, and so much more. So, like I said, imagine if you were one of those people. Well, at the collision, one of the lookouts, a man named Frederick Fleet, who unfortunately had committed suicide a good 50-something years later because of everything that had been bestowed upon him. He couldn't handle the pressure anymore. And knowing that was on his conscience for over 50 years, it's kind of sad hearing about that. And, may he rest in peace. But there was a statement from him in the Senate committee investigation after the incident. It was about the fact that he didn't have spyglasses, or, well, another way of saying binoculars, which obviously would have been very important equipment to have as a lookout. And see, the iceberg wasn't very easy to spot because light bends on water, especially at nighttime and in cold temperatures. So he wouldn't have been able to see the iceberg until he was until the ship was right on top of it, which is honestly a shame. He said iceberg ahead in the moment of it, about 11:30-ish that night. And at 11:40, that's when the ship had struck the iceberg, famously. And then the next 4 hours for the Titanic would be its last above the water. above the now watery grave it now has for the past over 100 years. So there's many theories and some important facts to consider when it came to the cause of the sinking. So an analyst, I can't remember his name, but he had said he looked at a photo of when the ship was still in Southampton, or I believe in Harland and Wolff shipyard, and he had seen a 30-foot scorch mark on near where the boiler area was. And so he said, well, there was a part of that investigation that said there may have been rumors of internal fire, and throughout the voyage they were trying to fight it this whole time. This, of course, this confession came from some of the engineers who were down there, either working on the boiler room or doing maintenance, or even some of the firefighters that were there trying to battle this fire the entire time. So that is what would have weakened the hull plates, because keep in mind that even though that the ship's metal was steel, many have claimed that the rivets that keep these sheets together were actually made of ore. Were actually made of iron, iron ore. And iron is a very weak, brittle material compared to very tough, rugged steel, And there's a term called slag. Slag is the excess bit of that iron if you were to shave it down to bits. And that is essentially what caused the risk of fracture, especially in the cold temperatures. That's what would make those iron rivets so weak. Upon the collision, however, the force from the impact absorbed into the weak points, and that's what influenced that massive gaping hole in the ship's hull, which would begin the sinking process. So there's another part of information I want to add on is when all the passengers, especially the second and third class passengers, there are many who left their portholes open, these windows on their walls where they can peek out and look at the ocean. Unfortunately, many of them were in such a rush that they didn't close them. So as the ship started to sink further down, that water would peek in through the portholes and only add on to the water weight, and of course sped the sinking process throughout the night, which is a very, very unfortunate factor to it. But there's many theories as far as during the sinking. So to combat the delay, especially the fog created by the warm weather coming in from the stream of wind off the coast of France, all the way towards what we would call the East Coast of the United States, which is roughly that frame of where they sank. Of course, the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. So in order to combat that, the ship remained at full speed, not to set a record of some kind, like most people would commonly believe, but there was actually a speculation that it would combat the possible combustion of coal in the boiler room. They want to get to New York as soon as possible so they can take care of any issues that were there, especially fighting this said fire that may have been there but was kept hush-hush, because you know how it is. At the point of the collision, the helmsman, the guy who basically steers the ship, he was trained on traditional tiller and rudder movement, which is more designated towards like wind sailing. Kind of odd, don't you think? Especially because at that time they were starting to get more into the ironclad and steel work when it came to ships and the material that they're made of. So you have to kind of adapt with the technology that was available to you at that point in time. So when first mate William Murdoch gave the order to hard right to starboard, he misinterpreted it. He thought to go right to avert the iceberg that was seen by Frederick Fleet, the lookout, to go right and whip around the iceberg. Instead, I'm sorry, I take that back. He misinterpreted it as instead of going left, he would go right to whip around the iceberg. Unfortunately, that only drew the ship closer to the iceberg. There was probably half a football field distance between the ship and the iceberg. Within a few minutes, they just eventually came closer and closer and closer, and then bam! That's when the impact was made. So, the famous woman and children first order that everyone knows, everyone has seen the movie, which is a great adaptation, by the way, the James Cameron film, way back to 1997, I believe, when it was filmed. It shows Leo DiCaprio in his younger days, Kate Winslet, that famous romance that everyone talks about. But it shows modern day when they discovered the Titanic in 1985 by accident, which is a very compelling story. If you know anything about that, please leave that in the comments. But anyhow, so many of the problems that I haven't mentioned already was when the collision happened. Like I said, these iron rivets, they were the weak points. And once the force was absorbed in, it caused the hull plates to buckle inwards along the starboard side, which then in turn would open 5 out of the 16 watertight compartments. Only 4 would have been permissible. So, which means it was one more than what would have kind of saved or at least stalled time. And unfortunately, that became a fatal factor to the sinking of the ship. So even though there was supposed to be at least between 45 to 50 lifeboats, there was 20, and 4 of which were collapsible, which means 4 out of those 20 were not in good shape. They probably wouldn't last in the water, and people in them, if they tried to get in the water, they might have drowned from the weight. It would give away, etc. So that bit, there's a couple theories that suggest Captain Smith might have had something to do with the collision because he commandeered the sister ship, the Olympic, at the time of its own collision with a Royal Navy ship, the HMS Hawk. There's a theory that the Titanic wasn't actually the one that sank, it was the Olympic. To further into that territory, so the Olympic, at the time of its own collision, it weakened a part of the hull, which was very similar to the same exact spot where the Titanic struck the iceberg, and also where that internal fire would have happened. So it weakened the hull, and they would have to just do a paint job on it for insurance reasons, which became insurance fraud. That was the big theory, insurance fraud theory. And why would they have the ship captain for the Olympic eventually become the captain of the Titanic? A little strange, don't you think? So yeah, throughout this video, if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, please leave it in the comments, and I'll be sure to answer them as soon as I can. So I don't know if I've mentioned it already, but the lookout that had the spyglass, or lack thereof, the spyglasses, the officers on the bridge carried a pair of them. Um, I know that the Lookouts did have them going from Belfast, Northern Ireland, from the shipyard to Southampton, England, but from Southampton, England on throughout its voyage, they were told they didn't have any. And yet the officers carried a pair. Pretty interesting, huh? You would have thought maybe one of the officers spotted it and didn't say anything. You never know. There's so many mysteries that go along with this sort of thing. And another major theory has to do with money. So this is the insurance fraud kind of ties into that. So the people that financed the trip of the Titanic were the International Mercantile Marine Corporation. J.P. Morgan, who at the time is known to be, if not the richest man in the world, kind of like that era's Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. He was nicknamed the Robber Baron, which is kind of interesting. A socialist or communist might nickname him that. So at the time, he wanted the United States to create a Federal Reserve Bank. Little side history note. 3 men had opposed that proposal, and 3 of those men were on that ship, the Titanic. You see where I'm going here? John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, and interesting enough, the co-founder of Macy's, Isidore Straus. All 3 men had died that night and were part of that number that didn't make it off the ship. So, what do you guys think? Yet again, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. And if they really did it for that reason, then honestly, all those people did not have to die. That was very, very cowardly of them. Just my personal opinion on the matter. Of course, this was a different time, and business was done a lot more, dirtier back then. But out of those 2,340 passengers and crew, only just short of 1,600. One second. Just short of 1,600 did not make it. 60 of those 126 kids I mentioned also did not make it. Most, if not all, the pets did not make it either. So when your body touches that cold of water, I mean like glacial water, within seconds, like milliseconds, it's so much shock to the body that if you don't die from the intense hypothermia, you probably would have died from the shock. And in some cases, throughout the process of the sinking, which I believe before it was completely submerged at 2:20 a.m. the following morning, the stern of the ship was pointed upward. So the very back of the ship pointed upward after the bit split. So the front split and then went straight into the ocean like that. So the back part started to do this all the way up and eventually slowly went down. It's pretty remarkable stuff. Some have even jumped, thinking they might have reached a boat in time. Some others had fell to their death. They may have hit the propellers on the way down. So speaking of which, at the moment when the iceberg was spotted, the central propeller, this massive propeller in the center, in the back of the ship, it was its main purpose was to give a lot more power to the rudders when they're rotating. So that's why the helmsman was given the order to keep going full speed. Really, they should have stopped the engines in an effort to stop the central propeller. That would have given them seconds, if not minutes, of time in order to avert the iceberg and save everyone's lives. So the legacy of this whole thing obviously has influenced ship safety. The Titanic back then was the largest ship in existence as far as length, but it is a dwarf compared to modern day cruise ships. And a lot of cruise ship safety guidelines kind of follow the example of what not to do. Two most notable people that did not make it that night, that they fell to their watery death, or that they sunk with the ship, were actually the chief naval architect at Harland and Wolff. That was Mr. Thomas Andrews. So he was the one who designed the ship. He felt that this was my creation. I have royally screwed up. It's probably my time. Here I am. Captain Smith, he went straight to the bridge where the wheel was and awaited his fate. Pretty nasty way to go, but at the time it was a traditional the captain must go down the ship rule. So the women and children rule was not enforced directly and right away either. And the reason why is because the first mate, William Murdoch, the gentleman I had mentioned prior, he couldn't see a lot of women and children right away because most of them were second and third class passengers. So he was sending as much people as he can into the boats until he finally started to see second, third class passengers. There is one last theory I need to mention is especially to the second and definitely the third class. There's these lock gates, which of course you saw in the films. There was one a movie called A Night to Remember way back in 1958, and of course the more notable 1997 James Cameron film Titanic, where they're trying to get up above to the top from the second and third class, and many people in the third class specifically were gated off so they couldn't get to the top, and unfortunately many people had lost their lives that way. They went down with the ship sooner than most other people, and that may have been a demonstration of some kind of class warfare. Remember at the time this was also about the same time as the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks were taking power of what was then White Russia. When Soviets were starting to become a thing, and which is kind of ironic because when the James Cameron film came out, this was the backdrop of the Soviet Union, the socialist or communist ideals that Karl Marx may have had against this whole class thing, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Anyways, I'm all over the place with that. So, like I said, shoot me a like, subscribe to my channel. There'll be more to come. I believe my next topic will be space hurricanes in just one moment. Write a comment if you like, and I'll be sure to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you, and have a great Halloween